When Rebecca Martinez stepped into the freezing Pacific waters at 0400 hours, she had no idea that Chief Petty Officer Kane Thompson was already planning her failure. What happened next would either break her completely or forge her into something the Navy had never seen before. The alarm pierced through the darkness of the barracks at Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Coronado at exactly 3:30 a.m. Rebecca Martinez shot up from her narrow bunk, her heart already racing before her feet hit the cold concrete floor. Around her, 23 other candidates were going through the same ritual, grabbing gear, lacing boots, preparing for another day of what the Navy euphemistically called training, but what felt more like systematic torture. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca had been dreaming of this moment since she was 12 years old, watching a documentary about Navy SEALs with her father in their small apartment in Phoenix. While other girls her age were fantasizing about boy bands or planning sleepovers, Rebecca was doing push-ups in her bedroom and timing herself on mile runs around the neighborhood. Her father, a Marine veteran who'd been medically discharged after an IED explosion in Fallujah, initially tried to discourage her dreams. "Becca, sweetheart," he'd say, watching her struggle through pull-ups on the bar he'd installed in their doorway. "The military's different for women, especially the elite units. They're not ready for what you're trying to do." But Rebecca had inherited her father's stubborn streak and, more importantly, his absolute refusal to quit when things got difficult. By high school, she was running varsity cross-country, lifting weights with the football team, and maintaining a 3.9 GPA while working nights at a local diner to help with family expenses. When college recruiters came calling with athletic scholarships, Rebecca politely declined them all. She had a different destination in mind. The Naval Academy accepted her application, and for 4 years she excelled in every metric they threw at her. Academic performance, physical fitness, leadership evaluations, Rebecca consistently ranked in the top 5% of her class. Her instructors praised her tactical thinking, her ability to remain calm under pressure, and her natural instinct for leading others through complex scenarios. When graduation day arrived, she had her choice of assignments anywhere in the Navy. She chose BUDS, Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training. The decision shocked her classmates and frustrated her commanding officers. Here was a brilliant young officer with unlimited potential, they argued, and she was throwing it away on a program with a 90% failure rate. A program that, despite recent policy changes, had never graduated a single woman. "You're setting yourself up for failure, Martinez," her academy advisor had warned during their final meeting. "And worse, you're setting back the cause for every woman who might come after you. When you wash out, and statistics say you will, it gives ammunition to everyone who says women don't belong in special operations." Rebecca had listened politely, thanked him for his concern, and reported to Coronado 3 weeks later. Now, 6 weeks into the 24-week program, she was beginning to understand why so many people had tried to talk her out of it. BUDS wasn't just physically demanding, it was designed to identify and exploit every weakness, every fear, every moment of doubt that a candidate might harbor. The instructors were experts at finding the precise pressure point that would make someone quit, and they applied that pressure relentlessly. For most of their fellow candidates, the breaking point came during the notorious Hell Week, 5.5 days of continuous training with a maximum of 4 hours of sleep total. Rebecca had survived Hell Week, but barely. She'd watched 12 men ring the bell that signaled their withdrawal from the program, including Jason Wheeler, a former college football player who'd seemed indestructible during the first month of training. But surviving Hell Week hadn't made things easier. If anything, the instructors seemed to intensify their focus on the remaining candidates, looking for new ways to test their limits. And Chief Petty Officer Kane Thompson, the lead instructor for their phase of training, seemed to have developed a particular interest in testing Rebecca's. Thompson was a legend within the SEAL community, a 15-year veteran with deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, and several classified operations that were only whispered about in certain circles. He stood just under 6 feet tall, but his presence filled any room he entered. His arms were covered with scars from shrapnel and knife wounds, and his eyes held the kind of steady intensity that came from years of life-or-death decisions. From Rebecca's first day in the program, Thompson had singled her out for special attention. Not the encouraging kind, the kind designed to break her spirit. During physical training, while other instructors pushed candidates to their limits, Thompson pushed Rebecca beyond hers. When the class ran 5 miles, Rebecca ran 7. When they did 200 push-ups, Rebecca did 300. When they practiced underwater knot tying for 20 minutes, Rebecca stayed submerged for 35. "Martinez thinks she's special," Thompson would announce to the class during particularly brutal training sessions. "She thinks because she's got something to prove, that makes her different from the rest of you. But special gets you killed in the field. Special gets your teammates killed. So we're going to train that special right out of her." The other candidates began to resent Rebecca's presence. Not because they disliked her personally. She was well-liked, always willing to help struggling classmates and never complaining about the extra punishment she received. But they resented what her presence meant for them. Thompson's obvious campaign against Rebecca meant longer training sessions, more brutal physical challenges, and constant reminders that they were part of what he called an experiment that's destined to fail. Marcus Chen, a quiet former Marine who'd become Rebecca's closest friend in the program, finally confronted her about it during a rare break between training evolutions. "You know what he's doing, right?" Marcus asked, checking to make sure they weren't overheard. "Thompson's not trying to train you, he's trying to break you, and he's willing to put all of us through hell to do it." Rebecca nodded, toweling sweat from her face after completing a 2-hour ocean swim in rough seas. "I know. So why don't you just quit? I mean, no disrespect, but you could have any assignment in the Navy. You don't need this." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, watching the waves crash against the beach where they'd spent countless hours crawling through sand and surf. "My dad told me something once," she finally said. "He said the difference between Marines and everyone else isn't that Marines are tougher or stronger or braver. It's that when everyone else decides they've had enough, Marines decide they haven't had enough yet." Marcus shook his head. "That's Marine Corps propaganda, Becca. This is different. Thompson's not just trying to make you quit, he's trying to humiliate you. There's a difference." But Rebecca had already made her decision. If Thompson wanted to play games, she'd play along. If he wanted to single her out for punishment, she'd take whatever he could dish out and ask for more. And if he thought he could break her spirit by making her the target of his personal vendetta, he was about to learn just how wrong he could be. What Rebecca didn't know was that Thompson's campaign against her was about to escalate far beyond extra physical training and public humiliation. In his private office that evening, Thompson was reviewing her performance scores and planning something that would either destroy her career before it began or prove once and for all that she didn't belong in his program. The next phase of her training was underwater demolition, arguably the most technically challenging and dangerous part of BUD/S. Students learned to place explosives while holding their breath, navigate in zero visibility conditions, and perform complex calculations while managing oxygen debt and nitrogen narcosis. It required perfect execution under extreme stress, and even small mistakes could be fatal. Thompson smiled as he reviewed the training schedule. Tomorrow, Rebecca Martinez will face her biggest test yet, and if everything went according to his plan, it would be her last. The underwater demolition training pool at Coronado looked deceptively calm in the pre-dawn darkness. 50 meters long, 15 meters wide, and 12 meters deep. It had been the final testing ground for thousands of SEAL candidates over the decades. The water was kept at a constant 68 degrees, cold enough to add stress, warm enough to prevent hypothermia during extended training sessions. Rebecca arrived 15 minutes early, as she always did, using the extra time to mentally rehearse the procedures she'd studied the night before. The training evolution they'd face today was called combat swimmer navigation. Candidates would be given a set of coordinates, submerge to the bottom of the pool with a 50-pound demolition pack, navigate through a maze of underwater obstacles, plant the simulated explosive charge at the target location, and return to the surface, all while holding their breath for what typically lasted between 4 and 6 minutes. The challenge wasn't just physical, it was mental. Oxygen deprivation created a state called hypoxia that impaired judgment and motor skills. Candidates had to perform precise calculations while fighting their body's increasingly desperate urge to breathe. Many failed not because they couldn't hold their breath long enough, but because hypoxia caused them to make critical errors in navigation or explosive placement. Thompson emerged from the instructor facility, carrying a clipboard and wearing his characteristic scowl. Behind him followed Petty Officer First Class Danny Rodriguez and Lieutenant Junior Grade Sarah Kim, the two other instructors assigned to this phase of training. Rodriguez was known for his encyclopedic knowledge of explosives and his patience with struggling students. Kim, one of only 3 female officers in the entire Buds instructor cadre, had a reputation for being tough but fair. "Listen up, candidates," Thompson's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Today, you'll demonstrate that you can function as a combat swimmer under stress. Each of you will navigate the underwater course, plant your charge at the designated target, and return to the surface. You have 1 attempt. Failure means you repeat this entire phase of training." Repeating a phase meant starting over from the beginning, weeks of additional training, assuming they were even allowed to continue. Most candidates who had to repeat a phase eventually dropped out. "The pass-fail criteria are simple," Thompson continued. "Plant your charge within 2 meters of the target coordinates, with proper timer settings, and return to the surface within 7 minutes. Miss any of these requirements, and you fail." Rebecca noticed something odd in Thompson's tone when he looked directly at her during this briefing. There was a satisfaction there, almost like he was savoring a private joke. She filed that observation away and focused on the technical details Rodriguez was now explaining. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." The underwater course consisted of a series of steel frameworks that simulated the hull of a ship. Candidates would enter at one end, navigate through a series of turns and obstacles, locate the target area marked with a distinctive yellow panel, attach their simulated limpet mine, set the timer, and return to the surface. The route was complex enough that even experienced combat swimmers sometimes got disoriented. Marcus Chen went first. Rebecca watched from the pool deck as he took his final breath and disappeared beneath the surface with his equipment pack. The instructors tracked his progress using underwater cameras, their voices providing a clinical commentary on his performance. Good initial descent, maintaining proper buoyancy control, first turn executed cleanly. Marcus surfaced after 5 minutes and 38 seconds, gasping but triumphant. Rodriguez checked his explosive placement using an underwater camera, perfectly positioned, timer correctly set. A solid pass. 3 more candidates followed, each completing the evolution successfully. Rebecca began to feel more confident. The training was challenging but straightforward, exactly the kind of technical problem she excelled at solving. "Martinez, you're up," Thompson called. Rebecca approached the edge of the pool, running through her mental checklist one final time. She'd memorized the route, practiced the explosive placement procedures until they were automatic, and calculated her air consumption down to the second. Her equipment felt familiar in her hands: the breathing apparatus, the navigation board, the simulated limpet mine with its timer mechanism. "Any questions, Martinez?" Thompson asked, stepping closer than he needed to. "No, Chief. Ready to proceed." "Outstanding. Remember, 2 meters from target, proper timer setting, 7 minutes total. Those are the standards that separate SEALs from everyone else." Rebecca nodded, took her position at the pool's edge, and began the breathing exercises that would hyperventilate her blood and extend her breath-holding time. 3 minutes of controlled breathing, then a final massive inhalation that filled her lungs to capacity. She slipped into the water and immediately felt the familiar calm that came with being underwater. The surface noise disappeared, replaced by the subtle sounds of water movement and her own heartbeat. She descended quickly to the bottom of the pool, oriented herself using the compass on her navigation board, and began swimming toward the course entrance. The steel framework loomed ahead of her in the underwater lights. Rebecca entered the maze confidently, following the route she'd memorized. First section, straight ahead for 20 meters. Check. First turn, 90 degrees to the right. Check. Second section, 15 meters, then a sharp left turn to avoid the overhead obstacle. But when Rebecca made the left turn, something was wrong. The route she'd memorized called for a clear swimming lane, but instead, she found herself facing a dead end, a solid steel panel that hadn't been there during the briefing. She stopped, disoriented, and checked her compass. Her heading was correct, her distance calculations were accurate, but the physical layout didn't match what she'd been taught to expect. Precious seconds ticked away as Rebecca tried to understand what had happened. Had she made a navigation error? Had the hypoxia already begun affecting her judgment? She backtracked to the previous junction and tried a different route, but that led to another dead end. Her lungs were beginning to burn now, her body's CO2 levels rising as her oxygen reserves depleted. She had maybe 2 minutes of air left, and she still hadn't reached the target area. Panic tried to creep into her thoughts, the primal fear that every underwater swimmer knew, the voice that screamed at her to abandon the mission and race for the surface. Rebecca forced herself to stop and think. The course layout had been changed. Somehow, between the briefing and her actual run, someone had modified the underwater maze. But who would do that? And why? The answer came to her with sudden, crystal clarity. Thompson. This was his escalation, his way of ensuring she failed without leaving obvious fingerprints. He'd modified the course specifically for her run, knowing that she'd waste precious time trying to navigate a route that no longer existed. But Rebecca had spent too many years preparing for this moment to let Thompson's sabotage defeat her. If the memorized route didn't work, she'll have to improvise. She checked her compass and began swimming directly toward where the target should be, ignoring the designated route entirely. If Thompson wanted to change the rules, she'll adapt to whatever rules he created. The direct approach led her through sections of the course that weren't designed for swimmer transit. She had to squeeze through narrow gaps between steel beams, push through tangled cables that caught at her equipment, and navigate around obstacles that scraped against her wetsuit. But she was making progress toward the target area. Her lungs felt like they were on fire now, her vision beginning to tunnel as hypoxia affected her brain function. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, her body desperate for oxygen. Every instinct screamed at her to abort the mission, to drop her equipment and race for the surface. Instead, she pressed forward. The yellow target panel finally appeared through the murky water ahead of her. Rebecca's hands moved automatically through the explosive placement procedure. Remove the simulated limpet mine from her pack, activate the magnetic attachment system, position it against the hull, set the timer for the prescribed delay. Her movements were slower than they should have been, hypoxia making her fingers clumsy, but she managed to complete each step. Timer set, explosive placed. Now she just had to make it back to the surface. Rebecca's ascent felt like swimming through molasses. Her oxygen-starved muscles responded sluggishly to her commands, and she had to fight against the urge to rocket toward the surface too quickly, a mistake that could cause an air embolism and kill her. She forced herself to maintain a controlled ascent rate, even as her vision began to fade around the edges. She broke the surface gasping and choking, her body's automatic response to oxygen deprivation. Water filled her mouth as she struggled to breathe, her lungs burning as they desperately pulled in air. Through her oxygen-deprived haze, she could hear voices around her, the other candidates shouting encouragement, the instructors checking her condition. "Time," Rodriguez called out, 6 minutes, 52 seconds. Rebecca treaded water, still gasping, as Rodriguez used the underwater camera to check her explosive placement. The seconds stretched out endlessly as he moved the camera around the target area, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up from the monitor. Explosive placement verified. Distance from target, 1.8 meters. Timer setting is correct. That's a pass. The other candidates erupted in cheers, but Rebecca noticed that Thompson wasn't celebrating. In fact, he looked genuinely surprised, and not in a good way. He approached Rodriguez and spoke to him in low tones, gesturing toward the underwater camera monitor. "Chief, I'm seeing the placement correctly," Rodriguez replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She hit all the required standards." Thompson's jaw tightened, but he couldn't argue with the objective measurements. Rebecca had passed the evolution, despite whatever sabotage he'd arranged. But as she climbed out of the pool, she caught the look he gave her, a look of pure hatred that promised this wasn't over. Lieutenant Kim approached Rebecca with a towel and a concerned expression. "Martinez, can I speak with you privately?" They walked to a quiet section of the pool deck, away from the other candidates and instructors. Kim's expression was troubled as she watched Thompson arguing with Rodriguez near the equipment locker. "I want you to know that the course configuration you swam wasn't the one we briefed this morning," Kim said quietly. "Someone modified the underwater obstacles between the briefing and your run. That's never happened before in my 3 years here." Rebecca met her eyes. "Did you see who made the modifications?" "No direct proof, but I have suspicions." Kim glanced back toward Thompson, who was now dismissing the other candidates for their next training evolution. "Be careful, Martinez. What happened today, that was just the beginning." As Rebecca walked back to the barracks to change out of her wetsuit, she reflected on what had just occurred. Thompson had sabotaged her training evolution, confident that it would force her to fail. When she'd succeeded anyway, adapting to his trap and completing the mission against impossible odds, she'd proven something important. She could beat him at his own game. But she also knew that Kim was right. This was just the beginning. Thompson had shown his hand today, revealing that he was willing to go far beyond the normal bounds of training to eliminate her from the program. The question now was how far he would go, and whether she could survive whatever escalation came next. That evening, as Rebecca reviewed her notes for the next day's training, Marcus Chen found her in the common area of their barracks. "You know what happened today wasn't normal, right?" he said, keeping his voice low to avoid being overheard by the other candidates. Rebecca nodded. "I figured that out underwater." "So what are you going to do about it?" Rebecca looked up from her notes, her expression resolute. "I'm going to graduate first in our class, and I'm going to do it without compromising a single standard or asking for any special consideration." Marcus stared at her. "Becca, he's not going to stop. If anything, he's going to get worse." "Then I'll get better." "This isn't a game. He could get you killed." Rebecca closed her notebook and met his eyes. "Marcus, do you know what the mission statement of the Navy SEALs is?" He shook his head. "To deliver a strategic weapon to any location at any time under any conditions." That strategic weapon is the individual SEAL operator, someone who can adapt to any situation, overcome any obstacle, and complete any mission, regardless of the opposition they face. She stood up, gathering her materials. "Thompson thinks he's my opposition. What he doesn't understand is that he's actually my training. Every trap he sets, every sabotage he attempts, every impossible standard he creates, it's all just making me better at being what a SEAL needs to be." As she headed toward her bunk, Rebecca couldn't know that in his private office, Thompson was reviewing her performance video from that day's evolution and planning something far more dangerous than rearranging underwater obstacles. Her success had surprised him, but it had also taught him something important about his opponent. Rebecca Martinez wasn't going to quit, which meant he was going to have to find a different way to eliminate her from his program. The medical bay at Bud's training facility was a place most candidates hoped never to see. Located in a converted warehouse building adjacent to the main training compound, it housed everything from basic first aid supplies to advanced trauma equipment. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, the facility's chief medical officer, had seen every type of training injury imaginable over her 8 years at Coronado: broken bones, torn ligaments, hypothermia, oxygen toxicity, and the occasional case of what she diplomatically called acute training stress reaction. What she hadn't seen before was the pattern of injuries that Rebecca Martinez had accumulated over the past 3 weeks. "Roll up your sleeves, Martinez," Dr. Hayes instructed as Rebecca sat on the examination table for her mandatory weekly medical check. "Let me see those arms." Rebecca complied, revealing a constellation of bruises, cuts, and abrasions that covered both forearms. Some were fresh, still tender to the touch. Others had faded to the yellow-green color of healing tissue. Dr. Hayes photographed each injury with a digital camera, documenting their location and severity as she had for the past month. "These rope burn marks on your palms, they're deeper than last week, and this bruising on your ribs." Dr. Hayes probed gently, causing Rebecca to wince. "When did this happen?" "Yesterday's obstacle course evolution, ma'am. I took a hard fall from the cargo net." Dr. Hayes made a note in Rebecca's medical file. "And the lacerations on your back?" "Barbed wire crawl on Tuesday. Must have caught some wire I didn't see." The doctor continued her examination in silence, but her expression grew increasingly troubled. In her years at Buds, she'd developed an eye for distinguishing between normal training injuries and something more concerning. What she was seeing on Rebecca Martinez fell into the latter category. "Martinez, I need to ask you directly, are you experiencing any training that seems excessive or punitive in nature?" Rebecca met her eyes steadily. "No, ma'am, just standard Buds training." Dr. Hayes knew she was lying, but she also knew that Rebecca would never admit it. The code among SEAL candidates was absolute. You never complained, never reported unfair treatment, never gave anyone a reason to question your mental toughness, even if that code was literally killing you. "I'm going to recommend you for 48 hours of medical leave," Dr. Hayes said, reaching for her prescription pad. "Your body needs time to recover before—" "With respect, ma'am, I don't need medical leave. I'm physically fit for all training evolutions." "Martinez, look at yourself. You're carrying injuries that would sideline professional athletes. Your body fat percentage is below what we consider healthy for women. Your resting heart rate indicates chronic overtraining. You need rest." Rebecca's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, if you place me on medical leave, Chief Thompson will use it as grounds to remove me from the program. He'll say I can't handle the physical demands of SEAL training." Dr. Hayes stared at her for a long moment, understanding the impossible position Rebecca found herself in. Accept medical treatment and risk elimination from the program, or continue training while her body broke down incrementally. "Off the record," Dr. Hayes said finally, "what's really happening out there?" Rebecca was quiet for several seconds, weighing her response. Finally, she spoke. "Thompson has decided I don't belong in his program, ma'am. He's doing everything he can to prove that point. But I'm still here, and I'm going to stay here until I graduate or he kills me trying to get rid of me." The blunt honesty of that statement sent a chill through Dr. Hayes. She'd heard rumors about Thompson's treatment of Rebecca, but hearing it confirmed by the candidate herself was different. "There are channels for reporting training abuse, Martinez, official procedures. That would end my career before it starts, ma'am, and it wouldn't change anything anyway. The next instructor would just be more subtle about it." Dr. Hayes finished her examination and updated Rebecca's medical file. Officially, she documented the injuries as consistent with rigorous training. Unofficially, she began keeping a separate record, one that might someday be needed if things went too far. "Martinez, get some sleep tonight, Martinez, and be careful out there." Rebecca left the medical bay and headed directly to the dining facility for dinner. The evening meal was one of the few times candidates could relax slightly, the conversation flowing more freely than during the constant tension of training hours. But as she entered the facility, Rebecca noticed something different about the atmosphere. The other candidates weren't talking to her. She picked up her tray and moved through the serving line, nodding to classmates who had been friendly just days earlier. Now they avoided eye contact, focusing intently on their food or engaging in conversations that stopped when she approached. By the time she reached an empty table, the message was clear. She was being isolated. Marcus Chen finally approached her table, but instead of sitting down, he remained standing. "We need to talk," he said quietly, "outside." They walked to a secluded area behind the dining facility, away from windows and potential eavesdroppers. Marcus's expression was troubled as he faced her. "Thompson called a meeting with our class this afternoon while you were at medical," he began. "He told us that your presence in the program was creating safety issues for everyone. Said that his focus on correcting your deficiencies was taking attention away from properly training the rest of us." Rebecca felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. "And?" "He said that anyone who continued to associate with you would be considered to be enabling behavior that was detrimental to team cohesion. He didn't order us to avoid you directly, but the implication was clear." "So you're all going to abandon me because Thompson wants you to?" Marcus looked genuinely pained. "Becca, it's not that simple. Half the guys in our class are already on the borderline for washout. They can't afford to give Thompson any excuse to target them too. And the other half, they're starting to believe maybe he's right. Maybe having you here is making everything harder for everyone." Rebecca stared at him, feeling the full weight of Thompson's strategy becoming clear. It wasn't enough to sabotage her training or pile on extra punishment. He was systematically destroying her support network, isolating her from the camaraderie that helped every candidate survive the psychological pressure of buds. "What about you?" she asked. "Are you going to abandon me too?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "I don't want to, but I also don't want to wash out because I stood by someone who Thompson has decided to destroy. I'm sorry, Becca. I really am." He walked away, leaving Rebecca standing alone in the gathering darkness. For the first time since arriving at Bud's, she felt the weight of true despair settling on her shoulders. The physical challenges she could handle, the sabotage and unfair treatment she could endure. But the complete isolation from her peers, that was something she hadn't prepared for. The next morning brought a new evolution that Rebecca had been dreading: team-based combat swimming. Candidates were divided into pairs and tasked with navigating an underwater obstacle course while sharing a single air supply. It required absolute trust and coordination between partners, with each swimmer taking turns breathing from the shared regulator while the other held their breath. Thompson announced the pairings with obvious relish. Chen and Williams, Rodriguez and Palmer, Johnson and Davis. He continued down the list until only Rebecca remained unpaired. "Martinez, you'll be working with candidate Foster." Rebecca's heart sank. Brad Foster was the one candidate in their class who had made his resentment of her presence absolutely clear from day one. A former college wrestler from Alabama, Foster had repeatedly made comments about women in combat roles and had been openly hostile whenever forced to work with Rebecca during previous evolutions. Foster approached her with undisguised annoyance. "Just so we're clear, Martinez, I'm not going to slow down or make any special accommodations because you're a woman. If you can't keep up, that's your problem." "I wouldn't expect you to," Rebecca replied evenly. "Let's just focus on completing the evolution." The underwater course was more complex than previous challenges, a series of tunnels and chambers that simulate navigating through a flooded ship. Partners would enter together, sharing air through a buddy breathing system, and work their way to a target location where they would plant simulated explosives before returning to the surface. Foster announced the pairings with obvious relish. Chen and Williams, Rodriguez and Palmer, Johnson and Davis. He continued down the list until only Rebecca remained unpaired. "Martinez, you'll be working with candidate Foster." Rebecca's heart sank. Brad Foster was the one candidate in their class who had made his resentment of her presence absolutely clear from day one. A former college wrestler from Alabama, Foster had repeatedly made comments about women in combat roles and had been openly hostile whenever forced to work with Rebecca during previous evolutions. Foster approached her with undisguised annoyance. "Just so we're clear, Martinez, I'm not going to slow down or make any special accommodations because you're a woman. If you can't keep up, that's your problem." "I wouldn't expect you to," Rebecca replied evenly. "Let's just focus on completing the evolution." The underwater course was more complex than previous challenges, a series of tunnels and chambers that simulate navigating through a flooded ship. Partners would enter together, sharing air through a buddy breathing system, and work their way to a target location where they would plant simulated explosives before returning to the surface. Foster took the regulator first as they descended to the course entrance. Foster could see the arrogance in his movements, the way he held on to the air longer than necessary before passing it to her. When she took her turn breathing, Foster watched the timer on his watch with obvious impatience, tapping his finger against his mask to signal when she thought she'd had enough air. They entered the first tunnel section, Foster leading the way with Rebecca close behind. The space was narrow, barely wide enough for one swimmer, requiring them to move in single file. Foster moved quickly through the passage, not bothering to check that Rebecca was keeping up. Halfway through the tunnel, Foster suddenly stopped and began a buddy breathing procedure. Except instead of passing the regulator to Rebecca, he took an extended series of breaths before finally handing it over. By the time Rebecca got the regulator, her lungs were burning from oxygen deprivation. She took her allotted breaths and tried to pass the regulator back, but Foster was already moving again, forcing her to follow while still holding her breath. The pattern continued through the next section, Foster taking more than his share of air while giving Rebecca barely enough to maintain consciousness. In the third section of the course, Foster made his move. As they squeezed through a particularly narrow passage, he suddenly stopped and began the buddy breathing exchange. But when Rebecca reached for the regulator, Foster pulled it away, shaking his head and pointing at his watch as if to indicate it wasn't her turn yet. Rebecca's lungs were screaming for air. She gestured frantically at the regulator, but Foster continued to hold it away from her, a cold smile visible behind his mask. The message was clear. He was going to let her drown rather than share the air supply properly. Hypoxia began clouding Rebecca's judgment, her vision tunneling as her oxygen-starved brain struggled to function. Foster watched her growing desperation with obvious satisfaction, finally offering the regulator just as her body began involuntary spasms from oxygen deprivation. But instead of taking the regulator, Rebecca made a different choice. She grabbed Foster's weight belt and yanked it loose, sending him tumbling toward the bottom of the course. As he struggled to maintain his buoyancy, Rebecca took the air supply and began breathing normally for the first time in several minutes. Foster's eyes went wide with rage and alarm. Without his weight belt, he was struggling to control his ascent, his positive buoyancy threatening to send him rocketing toward the surface, a potentially fatal mistake that could cause decompression sickness or air embolism. Rebecca watched him struggle for several seconds, then made a decision that would define the rest of her time at Bud's. She swam down to Foster, grabbed him around the waist, and used her own weight belt to help control his ascent. Together, they made a controlled swim to the surface, Rebecca maintaining proper decompression procedures despite Foster's attempts to murder her just minutes earlier. They broke the surface together, both gasping. Foster looked confused and angry, clearly not understanding why Rebecca had saved him after what he'd tried to do. Around them, instructors were recording their performance, making notes on clipboards. "Martinez, Foster, report to the instructor platform immediately." Thompson's voice cut across the water like a blade. As they swam to the platform, Rebecca could see the satisfaction in his expression. Whatever had happened underwater, he was confident it would give him grounds to remove her from the program. "Foster, explain what happened down there," Thompson demanded. Foster hesitated, glancing between Rebecca and Thompson. "Sir, there was an equipment malfunction. Martinez lost control of her weight belt, and I had to assist her to the surface." Rebecca stared at him in shock. Foster was covering for her, claiming that she had been the one in trouble rather than admitting that he had tried to kill her. Thompson's expression darkened. He'd clearly expected a different story, one that would paint Rebecca as panicked, incompetent, or dangerous to her teammates. "Martinez, confirm Foster's account." Rebecca met Thompson's eyes steadily.
Sir, candidate Foster performed excellently as my diving partner. He maintained proper safety protocols throughout the evolution and assisted me when I experienced equipment difficulties. The lie came easily, and Rebecca could see Thompson's frustration as his trap failed to spring. He'd paired her with the most hostile candidate in their class, expecting either that Foster would report her as unfit or that she would complain about his treatment. Instead, both candidates were presenting a united front that painted each other as competent and professional. "Dismissed," Thompson said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. As they swam back to the preparation area, Foster spoke quietly so only Rebecca could hear. "Why didn't you rat me out? You had every right to." Rebecca looked at him, seeing something different in his expression now, a grudging respect mixed with confusion. "Because that's not who I am, and maybe it's not who you are either." That evening, Rebecca sat alone in the barracks common area reviewing her notes for the next day's training. The isolation from her classmates was complete now. Even Marcus avoided making eye contact. But something had changed during the underwater incident with Foster. Word had spread through the class about what had really happened, and while none of them were willing to openly associate with her, there was a new current of respect in their avoidance. She didn't know that in his office, Thompson was making phone calls to higher command, arguing that Rebecca Martinez represented a safety risk to other candidates and should be removed from the program immediately. His superiors were asking uncomfortable questions about his methods and the pattern of injuries Rebecca had sustained.
What Rebecca did know was that she had reached a turning point. Thompson's escalating campaign had nearly killed her today, and it was only going to get worse. But she had also discovered something important about herself. When pushed to her absolute breaking point, when isolated and attacked from all sides, she didn't break. She became stronger. The final phase of her ordeal was about to begin, and neither Rebecca nor Thompson fully understood how far the other was willing to go. But one way or another, it would end soon. The question was whether Rebecca Martinez would survive it intact. Commander James Harrison had been overseeing naval special warfare training programs for 12 years. And in that time, he'd learned to recognize when something was seriously wrong. The phone call he'd received that morning from Bud's medical officer, Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, had set off every alarm bell in his experienced mind. "Sir, I need to speak with you about candidate Martinez," Dr. Hayes had said, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who was about to report something significant. "I've been documenting some concerning patterns in her medical examinations." Now, sitting in his office at Naval Special Warfare Command Headquarters in Little Creek, Virginia, Harrison was reviewing the digital photographs and medical reports that Dr. Hayes had transmitted under secure channels. What he saw made his jaw tighten with anger. The progression of injuries was unmistakable. Week by week, Rebecca Martinez had accumulated damage that went far beyond normal Bud's training stress. The rope burns, contusions, lacerations, and signs of chronic overtraining painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as instruction. Harrison picked up his secure phone and dialed the number for Captain Robert Chen, the commanding officer of Bud's training at Coronado. Chen answered on the second ring. "Captain, this is Commander Harrison at NSW Command. I'm looking at some troubling medical documentation regarding one of your candidates. Martinez, Rebecca. I need a full briefing on her training status." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, Martinez is a challenging case. She's shown exceptional determination, but her presence has created some friction within the training cadre. Chief Thompson has expressed concerns about her impact on class cohesion and safety protocols. Captain, I'm looking at photographs of injuries that suggest something far beyond normal training friction. I want a complete investigation initiated immediately, and I want Thompson's training methods reviewed by an independent observer. Sir, with respect, Chief Thompson is one of our most experienced instructors. His methods may be unorthodox, but his graduation rates—" "Captain, I'm interrupting," Harrison almost shouted, his voice carrying the steel of absolute command authority. "Let me be clear. If these injuries are the result of discriminatory treatment or training abuse, heads are going to roll. And they're going to start rolling at the top. Do I make myself understood?" "Yes, sir. I'll initiate the investigation immediately." "Good. And, Captain, Martinez is not to be informed of this investigation. I want to see how this plays out without any external influence on the training environment." Harrison hung up the phone and immediately placed another call to Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the Navy's top specialist in training standards and candidate protection protocols. If there was systematic abuse happening at Buds, Mitchell would find it. Meanwhile, at Coronado, Captain Chen was facing the uncomfortable reality that his most celebrated instructor might be a liability. Thompson's reputation within the SEAL community was legendary, a combat veteran whose training methods had produced some of the Navy's most elite operators. But legends could become liabilities when they crossed certain lines. Chen called Thompson to his office that afternoon, ostensibly for a routine training review. Thompson arrived punctually, as always, carrying his standard clipboard and wearing his characteristic expression of professional competence. "Chief, sit down. I want to discuss the Martinez situation." Thompson's expression didn't change, but Chen noticed a slight tension in his posture. "Sir, what specifically about Martinez?" "I'm getting questions from higher command about her training progression and medical status. There are concerns that she may be receiving disproportionate attention." "Sir, Martinez receives exactly the same training as every other candidate. If anything, I've been more patient with her than I would be with male candidates. But she continues to struggle with team integration and has shown repeated incidents of poor judgment under stress." Chen leaned back in his chair, studying Thompson's face. The chief was a master at maintaining his professional demeanor, but there was something in his tone when he spoke about Martinez, a personal edge that went beyond normal instructor concern. "Chief, I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there anything in your interactions with Martinez that could be construed as discriminatory or punitive in nature?" Thompson met his eyes steadily. "Absolutely not, sir. Every training evolution, every evaluation, every corrective action has been documented according to standard protocols. Martinez is struggling because she lacks the physical and mental capabilities required for SEAL operations, not because of any bias in her instruction." Nodded slowly. "I'm going to have Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell from NSW Command observe your training sessions for the next week. This is purely routine oversight, but I want everything documented meticulously." Thompson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, sir. I welcome any oversight that will demonstrate the professional standards we maintain here." But as Thompson left the captain's office, his mind was racing. An outside observer meant his methods would be scrutinized by someone who didn't understand the unique pressures of SEAL training. Someone who might interpret necessary toughness as abuse. Someone who could destroy his career based on politically correct notions about equal treatment. He had perhaps a week before Mitchell arrived to observe. A week to either break Martinez completely or find an excuse to remove her that would be beyond any investigator's ability to question. That evening, Rebecca was summoned to Thompson's office for what he called a performance counseling session. The office was spartanly furnished, a metal desk, 2 chairs, and walls covered with photographs of Thompson's SEAL teams from various deployments. Rebecca sat at attention while Thompson reviewed her training file. "Martinez, your performance over the past month has been inconsistent," Thompson began, his voice carrying the tone of disappointed authority. "While you've managed to pass most evolutions, your struggles have required excessive instructor attention and created safety concerns for other candidates." Rebecca remained silent, knowing that any response would be used against her. "I'm concerned that your determination to remain in this program may be clouding your judgment about your actual capabilities. Sometimes, the most courageous thing a candidate can do is recognize when they're not suited for SEAL operations and withdraw voluntarily. Sir,
I believe I'm fully capable of meeting all BUD standards and serving effectively as a SEAL operator. Thompson leaned forward, his expression hardening. Martinez, let me paint a picture for you. Even if you somehow manage to graduate from this program, which is statistically unlikely, you'll be assigned to a SEAL team. Those men will have to trust you with their lives in combat situations. Do you really think they'll be able to do that, knowing you only made it through training because instructors were afraid to apply the same standards to you that they apply to everyone else? The words hit Rebecca like physical blows, not because they were true, but because they represented her deepest fear. The possibility that she might graduate but never be truly accepted, never be trusted by the men she served alongside. Sir, I've never asked for any reduction in standards or special treatment. Haven't you? Thompson opened her file and began reading. Medical documentation shows repeated injuries requiring treatment. Your buddy breathing exercise with Foster resulted in an equipment malfunction that required rescue. Your underwater navigation exercise required multiple attempts to complete. These aren't signs of someone meeting standards, Martinez. These are someone being carried by instructors who are afraid to fail you. Rebecca felt her control slipping, the careful emotional discipline she'd maintained for months beginning to crack under Thompson's psychological assault. Sir, I've completed every required evolution within established parameters. Barely, and at what cost to your classmates? Do you know that 3 candidates have specifically requested not to be partnered with you for team exercises? Do you know that your presence has created a distraction that's affecting the entire class's performance? The lies came so smoothly, delivered with such professional authority that Rebecca almost believed themselves. Thompson was a master at psychological manipulation, using carefully selected truths mixed with fabrications to create a narrative of failure and inadequacy. I'm going to give you an opportunity, Martinez. One last chance to demonstrate that you belong in this program. Tomorrow's exercise will be solo night navigation, a 7-mile swim in open ocean in the dark with full equipment. No partner, no backup, no safety net. Complete the course within the time limit, hit all navigation points correctly, and I'll recommend you for continuation in the program. Rebecca's mind raced. Solo night navigation was an advanced exercise, typically reserved for the final weeks of BUDS training. Attempting it now, with her current level of preparation, would be extraordinarily dangerous. The Pacific Ocean at night was unpredictable, with currents, marine life, and hypothermia all posing serious threats. Sir, is this exercise part of the standard curriculum for our current phase? Thompson smiled coldly. Martinez, throughout your military career, you'll face situations that aren't part of any standard curriculum. SEAL operators adapt to whatever challenges they encounter. Unless you're saying you're not capable of adapting. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Refuse the challenge and be labeled as lacking the adaptability required for SEAL operations. Accept it and face a potentially fatal exercise designed to eliminate her from the program. I'll complete the exercise, sir. Outstanding. Report to the boat dock at 2200 tomorrow. Full combat equipment, standard navigation gear. You'll have 6 hours to complete the course.
As Rebecca left Thompson's office, she understood that this wasn't just another escalation in his campaign against her. This was his endgame, a challenge specifically designed to be impossible, giving him grounds to remove her from the program while maintaining plausible deniability about his motives. But what Thompson didn't know was that Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell had already arrived at Coronado and was reviewing every aspect of candidate training protocols. What he also didn't know was that Dr. Hayes had been quietly documenting his behavior patterns and building a case that would soon reach the highest levels of Naval Special Warfare Command. The final confrontation was approaching, and while Thompson believed he was orchestrating Rebecca's elimination, forces beyond his control were already moving to expose the truth about his methods. Rebecca spent that night preparing for what might be her last challenge as a BUDS candidate. She studied ocean current charts, reviewed navigation procedures, and mentally prepared herself for 7 miles of solo swimming in dangerous conditions. But she also wrote a detailed letter describing Thompson's treatment of her, sealed it in an envelope, and gave it to Marcus Chen with instructions to deliver it to Dr. Hayes if she didn't return from the exercise. "Becca, this is insane," Marcus said as he took the envelope. "Solo night navigation isn't even part of our curriculum yet. He's trying to kill you." "I know," Rebecca replied calmly, "but if I refuse, he wins. And if I die trying, at least there will be evidence of what he's been doing." She checked her equipment one final time and headed toward the boat dock, not knowing that Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was watching from the shadows, recording everything on a night vision camera. The investigation that would eventually destroy Thompson's career was already underway, but Rebecca would have to survive the next 6 hours to see justice done. The dark Pacific stretched before her like an endless void, and somewhere in that darkness lay either her vindication or her grave. The Pacific Ocean at 2200 hours was a living darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. Rebecca stood on the wooden dock at Coronado, her wetsuit already damp with nervous perspiration despite the cool night air. The water below reflected no stars, no moon, just an infinite black mirror that concealed currents, marine predators, and enough cold water to kill an unprepared swimmer within hours. Thompson stood beside the equipment table, clipboard in hand, wearing the satisfied expression of someone about to witness a long-awaited conclusion. Behind him, 2 safety officers waited in a rigid inflatable boat, their presence providing legal cover while offering no real protection for what Rebecca was about to attempt. "Your navigation points," Thompson said, handing her a waterproof chart case. 7 waypoints over approximately 7 miles. Each point must be verified by retrieving a numbered marker buoy. Miss any point or exceed the 6-hour time limit, and you fail the evolution. Rebecca studied the chart briefly, her heart sinking as she understood the true scope of Thompson's trap. The waypoints weren't arranged in a logical sequence that would allow efficient navigation. Instead, they formed a pattern that would force her to fight against the prevailing current for most of the swim, adding hours to what should have been a manageable distance. The first waypoint lay 2 miles directly offshore, requiring her to swim against the incoming tide. From there, the course zigzagged north and south along the coast before requiring a final push back to shore through the surf zone, the most dangerous part of any ocean swim, where waves could drive a tired swimmer into the rocky shoreline with lethal force. "Questions, Martinez?" Rebecca sealed the chart case and attached it to her gear harness. "No, sir. Ready to begin." "Outstanding. Your time starts now." Rebecca slipped into the water without fanfare, immediately feeling the shock of cold water penetrating her wetsuit. The Pacific off Coronado maintained a temperature around 62 degrees year-round, cold enough to sap strength and cloud judgment over extended exposure, but not cold enough to trigger immediate hypothermia. She began swimming with steady, efficient strokes, using the luminous dial of her diving compass to maintain her heading toward the first waypoint. Behind her, the lights of the training facility grew smaller, and ahead lay only darkness, broken by the occasional white cap of a larger wave. 20 minutes into the swim, Rebecca encountered the first real challenge. The incoming tide was stronger than she'd anticipated, forcing her to adjust her heading significantly to maintain progress toward the waypoint. Each stroke felt like swimming through molasses as the current tried to drag her back toward shore. But Rebecca had spent countless hours in the water over the past months, and her body had adapted to the demands of long-distance swimming. She found her rhythm and settled into the meditative state that experienced swimmers knew, where conscious thought faded and the body moved with mechanical efficiency through the water. What she didn't know was that 300 meters behind her, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was following in a darkened kayak using night vision equipment to document every aspect of the exercise. Mitchell had arrived at Coronado that afternoon and immediately recognized Thompson's solo navigation challenge as far outside normal training protocols. After reviewing Rebecca's training file and medical records, Mitchell had convinced Captain Chen to allow covert observation of the exercise. If Thompson was indeed conducting unauthorized and dangerous training, Mitchell intended to gather evidence that would end his career. Through her night vision scope, Mitchell watched Rebecca's progress with growing concern. The waypoint pattern was obviously designed to exhaust the swimmer, and the time limit was unrealistic for the distance and conditions. This wasn't training, it was attempted murder disguised as instruction. Mitchell activated her encrypted radio and contacted the safety boat. "This is Observer 1. I want continuous visual contact with the candidate. If she shows any signs of distress, you intervene immediately." "Copy, Observer 1. We have her on thermal imaging." Back in the water, Rebecca reached the first waypoint after 45 minutes of grueling swimming against the current. The marker buoy was exactly where the chart indicated, floating in the darkness like a beacon. She retrieved the numbered tag and immediately consulted her compass for the heading to waypoint 2. The second leg of the course took her north along the coast, parallel to shore but still far enough out to be affected by the strong currents. This section felt easier, with the tide helping rather than hindering her progress. But Rebecca knew from studying the chart that this apparent relief was temporary. The course would soon turn back offshore, forcing her to fight the current again. As she swam, Rebecca's mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with her father before leaving for Bud's training. He'd been sitting in his wheelchair on the small porch of their Phoenix apartment, looking out at the desert landscape that was so different from the ocean she was now crossing. "You know, mija," he'd said, using the Spanish endearment he'd called her since childhood. "The hardest battles aren't the ones where you're fighting the enemy. They're the ones where you're fighting people who are supposed to be on your side." At the time, Rebecca had thought he was talking about bureaucracy and military politics. Now, struggling through dark water while fighting exhaustion and hypothermia, she understood he'd been preparing her for exactly this moment. Waypoint 2 came and went, then waypoint 3. Rebecca was 2 hours into the swim now, and her body was beginning to protest. The cold was seeping through her wetsuit, making her muscles stiff and unresponsive. Her shoulders ached from the constant swimming motion, and her legs felt heavy despite the buoyancy of the salt water. The fourth waypoint took her further offshore than any of the previous points, nearly 3 miles from the safety of land. As she swam through the darkness, Rebecca became aware of movements in the water around her, the subtle disturbances that indicate marine life. She tried not to think about the great white sharks that frequented these waters, focusing instead on maintaining her navigation heading. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, still following at a discreet distance, was documenting everything through her night vision equipment. The exercise had already exceeded any reasonable training standard, and they were only halfway through the course. She activated her radio again. "Safety boat, what's the candidate's condition?" "She's maintaining steady progress, but thermal imaging shows significant heat loss. Core temperature is probably dropping into the danger zone." Mitchell made a decision that would later prove crucial to the investigation. "I want medical personnel standing by at the dock. If she completes this exercise, she's going to need immediate treatment for hypothermia." In the water, Rebecca was fighting a battle against her own body's survival instincts. Hypothermia was beginning to affect her judgment, making navigation more difficult and slowing her reaction times. The darkness seemed to be pressing in around her, and several times she had to stop swimming to check her compass because she'd lost track of her heading. Waypoint 5 was the turning point, literally and figuratively. From this position, the course began the final push back toward shore, but it also required swimming against the current for the remaining distance. Rebecca retrieved the marker tag with numb fingers and consulted her chart for the heading to waypoint 6. That's when she saw the lights. 3 sets of navigation lights were approaching from the north, a pattern that indicated military vessels rather than civilian boats.
Rebecca treaded water and watched as the lights drew closer, eventually resolving into fast patrol boats from the Navy's Special Warfare Unit. One of the boats altered course and approached her position. As it drew near, Rebecca could see figures in military uniforms manning the deck. A powerful spotlight illuminated the water around her, and someone spoke through a megaphone. "Candidate Martinez, this is Commander Harrison from Naval Special Warfare Command. You are ordered to terminate this exercise immediately and come aboard." Rebecca floated in the spotlight's glare, her hypothermia-clouded mind struggling to process this development. Terminate the exercise? But she was so close to completion. Only 2 waypoints remained between her and vindication.
"Sir, I can complete the course," she called back, her voice hoarse from the cold and exertion. "Negative, Martinez. This exercise has been determined to be outside authorized training parameters. You will board this vessel immediately." The reality of the situation finally penetrated Rebecca's hypothermic confusion. Someone had been watching. Someone had recognized that Thompson's challenge was illegitimate. Someone with enough authority to override Thompson's orders had intervened. But as the boat crew helped her out of the water, Rebecca felt a mixture of relief and frustration. She'd been so close to proving that she could meet any challenge Thompson devised. Now she'd never know if she could have completed the impossible course. Commander Harrison wrapped her in thermal blankets and began asking questions while the boat raced back toward shore. His expression was grim as he documented her condition and the circumstances of the exercise. "Martinez, I need you to understand that what happened tonight was not legitimate training. Chief Thompson exceeded his authority and placed you in unnecessary danger. This incident is now part of a formal investigation into training procedures at BUD/S." Through her hypothermic fog, Rebecca tried to process the implications. An investigation meant Thompson's methods would be scrutinized. It also meant her own future in the program was uncertain. "Sir, will this affect my standing in BUD/S?" Harrison's expression softened slightly. "Martinez, based on what I've observed tonight and the documentation we've gathered over the past week, I believe you've been subjected to training abuse that violates every standard we maintain. Your standing in the program isn't in question. Thompson's is." As the boat approached the dock, Rebecca could see a crowd of people waiting. Medical personnel with stretchers and warming equipment, Captain Chen and other senior officers. And standing apart from the group, looking like a man watching his career collapse in real time, Chief Petty Officer Kane Thompson. Dr. Hayes took charge of Rebecca's medical care the moment they reached the dock, immediately beginning treatment for moderate hypothermia and exhaustion. As Rebecca was loaded into an ambulance for transport to the base hospital, she caught Thompson's eye one final time. The hatred was still there, but it was mixed now with something else, the recognition that his war against her was over and he had lost. But as the ambulance doors closed and Rebecca was rushed toward medical treatment, neither she nor Thompson understood the full scope of what had been set in motion. The investigation that had begun with Dr. Hayes' medical documentation and Commander Harrison's concerns was about to expose a pattern of abuse that extended far beyond one candidate's treatment. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell had hours of video evidence, Dr. Hayes had months of medical documentation, and most importantly, other candidates were beginning to come forward with their own stories of Thompson's methods. The system that had protected Thompson for so long was finally ready to hold him accountable. But first, Rebecca had to survive the physical and emotional toll of her ordeal and prepare for the final phase of her BUD/S training, assuming she would be allowed to continue. In the ambulance, as warmth gradually returned to her body, Rebecca made a promise to herself. Whatever came next, she would see this through to the end. Thompson had tried to break her and failed. Now it was time to find out if she really had what it took to earn the trident that symbolized acceptance into the SEAL Brotherhood. The hardest part of her journey was behind her. The most important part was just beginning. The Naval Special Warfare Command Conference Room in Little Creek, Virginia, had seen many difficult conversations over the years, but few as consequential as the one taking place on a cold February morning 3 weeks after Rebecca's nighttime rescue from the Pacific.
Seated around the polished oak table were some of the most senior officers in the SEAL community, their collective experience spanning decades of special operations and training oversight. Admiral Patricia Westbrook, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, sat at the head of the table reviewing the investigation report that would determine the fate of both Chief Petty Officer Kane Thompson and the entire BUDS-S training program. The document was 3 inches thick, containing video evidence, medical records, testimony from multiple candidates, and expert analysis of training protocols. "Gentlemen, ladies," Admiral Westbrook began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had broken barriers throughout her own career. "We're here to address the most serious training misconduct case in the history of this command. The evidence presented by Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's investigation paints a picture of systematic abuse that violates every principle we claim to uphold." She activated the room's projection system, displaying a timeline that chronicled Thompson's treatment of Rebecca Martinez over the past months. Medical photographs, training videos, documented incidents. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable.
Chief Thompson's actions weren't just unprofessional, Admiral Westbrook continued. They were criminals. He deliberately sabotaged training equipment, falsified performance records, and ultimately attempted to kill a candidate through an unauthorized exercise designed to cause failure or death. Captain Chen, who had flown in from Coronado for the hearing, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Admiral, while I acknowledge serious errors in judgment occurred, I believe characterizing Thompson's actions as attempted murder." "Captain," Admiral Westbrook interrupted, her tone cutting, "Thompson sent a hypothermic candidate into open ocean at night, alone, with a course designed to exhaust her beyond safe limits. The only reason Martinez survived was because Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was conducting covert surveillance. Without that intervention, we would be investigating a training fatality instead of training abuse." The room fell silent as the full implications settled over the assembled officers. Training deaths were rare but devastating events that triggered congressional investigations and public scrutiny of the entire special operations community. Commander Harrison, who had led the initial investigation, spoke up. "Admiral, there's another aspect to this case that needs addressing. Our investigation revealed that Thompson's behavior toward female candidates wasn't isolated to Martinez. We found evidence of similar treatment toward 3 previous women who attempted BUDS training over the past 5 years. Admiral Westbrook nodded grimly, all of whom withdrew from the program citing personal reasons rather than filing formal complaints. Thompson was systematically eliminating female candidates through abuse while maintaining plausible deniability about his methods. The discussion that followed would reshape how the Navy approached special operations training for years to come. New oversight protocols, mandatory recording of all training evolutions, and independent medical monitoring were implemented immediately. But the most significant change was philosophical. The acknowledgement that the old ways of training, which relied on instructors' unlimited authority and candidate silence about abuse, were no longer acceptable. Thompson himself had been quietly transferred to a desk job pending the outcome of formal court-martial proceedings. His legendary status within the SEAL community evaporated overnight as the truth about his methods became known. The man who had been held up as the epitome of SEAL training excellence was revealed as a criminal who had used his position to prey on those under his authority. Meanwhile, at Coronado, Rebecca was experiencing a completely different version of BUDS training. With Thompson gone and new oversight protocols in place, she found herself being evaluated by instructors who were focused on legitimate training rather than personal vendettas. Lieutenant Commander Michael Torres had been brought in to replace Thompson as the lead instructor for Rebecca's training phase. A 15-year SEAL veteran with deployments to 3 different theaters, Torres had a reputation for being demanding but fair. His first meeting with Rebecca set a tone that was completely different from anything she'd experienced under Thompson. "Martinez, I've reviewed your training file and the circumstances that led to the investigation. I want you to know that you'll be evaluated based solely on your performance and your potential as a SEAL operator. The games are over." For the first time in months, Rebecca felt like she could breathe. "Thank you, sir.
I just want the chance to prove myself on a level playing field. You'll get that chance. But I also want you to understand that graduating from buds is just the beginning. The real test comes when you're assigned to a team and have to earn the respect of operators who may still have doubts about women in special operations. Torres was right, and Rebecca knew it. The investigation had cleared the way for her to complete training, but it hadn't changed the fundamental challenge she would face as the first woman to graduate from buds. She would have to be not just competent, but exceptional. The final months of her training passed in a blur of increasingly complex evolutions. Advanced combat diving, explosives training, close quarters combat, and tactical leadership exercises, each designed to test different aspects of a candidate's readiness for SEAL operations. Without Thompson's sabotage and psychological warfare, Rebecca found herself excelling in ways that surprised even her. Marcus Chen, who had been transferred to a different training class during the investigation, sought her out during a rare break between training phases. "I owe you an apology," he said, finding her studying in the barracks common area. "When Thompson told us to avoid you, I should have stood up for what was right instead of protecting my own interests." Rebecca looked up from her tactical manual, studying her former friend's face. "Marcus, you were trying to survive buds just like everyone else. I don't blame you for that, but you should. We all knew what Thompson was doing was wrong, and we let it happen because we were afraid. That's not the kind of person I want to be, and it's definitely not the kind of SEAL operator this community needs." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Brad Foster, the candidate who had tried to kill Rebecca during the buddy breathing exercise months earlier. Foster looked uncomfortable as he approached them. "Martinez, can I talk to you for a minute?" Rebecca nodded, curious about what Foster could possibly want to discuss. "I've been thinking about what happened during that underwater evolution," Foster began, his voice lacking its usual arrogance, "about how you saved my life after what I tried to do to you. I need you to know that I've been seeing a counselor about my attitudes toward women in the military, and I need you to know that if anyone ever questions your right to be here, they'll have to deal with me first."
The transformation was remarkable. Foster, who had been Thompson's most willing accomplice in the campaign against Rebecca, had undergone a complete change in perspective. He would later become one of her strongest advocates within their class. As graduation approached, Rebecca found herself leading her class in overall performance rankings. The combination of her natural abilities, enhanced by months of surviving Thompson's abuse, had forged her into an exceptional candidate. Her navigation skills were flawless, her combat swimming times ranked among the best in Bud's history, and her tactical thinking impressed even the most skeptical instructors. The graduation ceremony took place on a brilliant sunny morning in late spring. Families, friends, and military dignitaries gathered to witness 23 candidates receive their SEAL Tridents, the distinctive gold pin that marked their entry into one of the world's most elite military units. Rebecca's father had flown in from Phoenix for the ceremony, his wheelchair positioned in the front row where he could see everything clearly. Despite his disability, he wore his dress blue Marine uniform, the ribbons on his chest telling the story of his own service and sacrifice. Admiral Westbrook herself presided over the ceremony, and when she reached Rebecca's name on the graduation roster, she paused to address the assembled crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, today marks not just the graduation of another exceptional Buds class, but a historic moment for naval special warfare. Petty Officer Second Class Rebecca Martinez is not just the first woman to graduate from Buds. She is graduating at the top of her class, with performance scores that rank among the highest in the program's history." The crowd erupted in applause, but Rebecca barely heard it. She was focused on her father's face, seeing the tears streaming down his cheeks as Admiral Westbrook pinned the trident to her uniform. "Your training has prepared you for the challenges ahead," Admiral Westbrook continued, speaking directly to Rebecca. "But more importantly, your conduct during training has demonstrated the kind of character and resilience that defines the SEAL community at its best. You have honored not just your own service, but the memory of every operator who came before you." After the ceremony, as families mingled with the new graduates, Rebecca found herself approached by a group of senior SEAL operators, men whose reputations were legendary within the special operations community. She expected skepticism, perhaps even hostility, but what she found was something entirely different. "Martinez," said Master Chief Petty Officer David Walsh, a 30-year SEAL veteran with more combat deployments than most people had birthdays, "I've been watching your training progression since the investigation began. I want you to know that when you're ready for a team assignment, I hope you'll consider joining my unit." The offer was extraordinary. Walsh commanded one of the Navy's most elite SEAL teams, a unit that typically only accepted operators with years of experience and proven combat records. The fact that he was offering to take a brand new graduate was unprecedented. "Master Chief, I'm honored by the offer, but I know I still have a lot to prove." Walsh smiled. "Martinez, you've already proven more than most operators do in their entire careers. What Thompson put you through was hell, but it forged you into something special. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong here." As the day wound down and families began to depart, Rebecca sat with her father on a bench overlooking the Pacific where she had endured so much punishment and found her strength. "Mija, I need to tell you something," her father said, his voice thick with emotion. "When you first told me you wanted to be a SEAL, I was terrified. Not because I didn't believe in you, but because I knew how hard the world would make it for you. But watching you today, seeing what you've accomplished, I've never been more proud of anything in my life." Rebecca leaned against her father's shoulder, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what she had achieved. The girl who had started doing push-ups in her bedroom in Phoenix had become the first woman to earn the Navy SEAL Trident. But more than that, she had proven that excellence and determination could overcome any obstacle, no matter how powerful or entrenched. Thompson's court-martial would conclude 6 months later, with his conviction on charges of training abuse, endangering military personnel, and conduct unbecoming. He was sentenced to 2 years in military prison and discharged from the Navy with forfeiture of all benefits. His case became a landmark in military justice, establishing new precedents for protecting candidates from instructor abuse. But Thompson's fate was less important than what Rebecca had achieved. She had not just broken a barrier, she had shattered it so completely that no one could ever again claim that women couldn't meet the standards required for SEAL operations. 6 months after graduation, Petty Officer Second Class Rebecca Martinez deployed to Afghanistan with Master Chief Walsh's team. Her first combat operation would prove that her success in training was no fluke. She was exactly what the SEAL community needed, even if they hadn't known it at the time. The girl from Phoenix had become a warrior, and the warrior had become a legend. But perhaps most importantly, she had opened a door that could never be closed again, ensuring that future generations of women would have the opportunity to serve at the highest levels of military excellence. Thompson had tried to break her and failed. Instead, he had forged her into something stronger than he could have ever imagined. And in doing so, he had changed the course of military history forever. 2 years after her historic graduation from BUDS, Petty Officer First Class Rebecca Martinez crouched behind a crumbling concrete wall in a compound outside Kandahar, Afghanistan, listening to the steady rhythm of automatic weapons fire echoing through the valley below. The intelligence briefing had been clear. A high-value target was holed up in the fortified compound ahead, surrounded by an unknown number of hostile fighters and enough explosives to level half the village. Master Chief Walsh's voice crackled through her radio earpiece. "Martinez, what's your assessment of the northern approach?" Rebecca studied the terrain through her night vision scope, cataloging defensive positions, potential ambush sites, and the most likely routes for a successful assault. The skills she developed during those brutal months at BUDS, the ability to think clearly under extreme pressure, to adapt to changing circumstances, to push through physical and mental barriers, were now being tested in the deadliest classroom imaginable. North approach is compromised, Master Chief. They've got overlapping fields of fire from the two guard towers, and thermal imaging shows at least 4 fighters in concealed positions along the access route. But there's a blind spot on the northeast corner where the drainage ditch provides concealed movement to within 50 meters of the main building. Copy that. Rodriguez, Chen, you're hearing this? The voices of her teammates confirmed they were monitoring her tactical assessment. Petty Officer 2nd Class Carlos Rodriguez and Petty Officer 1st Class Michael Chen were veterans with multiple combat deployments, operators who had initially been skeptical about working with the Navy's first female SEAL. That skepticism had evaporated during their first mission together, when Rebecca's navigation skills had guided them through a minefield that would have killed less experienced operators. Martinez takes points on the northeast approach, Walsh decided. Rodriguez and Chen provide overwatch from position 7. I'll coordinate with air support for diversionary fire on the south wall. As Rebecca began moving through the darkness toward her assigned position, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had struggled through Thompson's sadistic training regimen was now leading combat operations in one of the world's most dangerous environments. Every challenge Thompson had thrown at her, the sabotaged equipment, the impossible standards, the psychological warfare, had inadvertently prepared her for exactly this kind of situation. The drainage ditch was deeper than it had appeared through her scope, providing excellent concealment but forcing her to crawl through knee-deep mud that reeked of sewage and decay. Rebecca controlled her breathing, moving with the patience that came from months of underwater navigation training, where rushing meant death. Each movement was deliberate, calculated, silent. 50 meters from the compound, she could hear voices speaking in Pashto, the local dialect she'd studied during her pre-deployment training. 3 fighters were discussing the American forces they knew were in the area, their conversation revealing crucial intelligence about the compound's defenses. Rebecca activated her radio transmitter and whispered her translation to the team. "Master Chief, they're expecting us to assault from the south. They've moved most of their forces to that side of the compound. The north wall is only lightly defended." Outstanding intel, Martinez. Stand by for a revised assault plan. The firefight that followed lasted 18 minutes. Rebecca's reconnaissance had allowed the team to exploit a weakness in the enemy's defensive plan, avoiding the prepared kill zone and striking where they were least expected. By the time the shooting stopped, the high-value target was in custody and the team was moving toward their extraction point with 0 friendly casualties. But it was what happened after the mission that would prove most significant for Rebecca's career and the broader SEAL community. 3 days later, Rebecca received an encrypted message directing her to report to the command center at Bagram Airfield for a secure video conference with Naval Special Warfare Command. She found herself seated in front of a high-definition monitor displaying the familiar conference room at Little Creek, where Admiral Westbrook and several other senior officers were waiting. "Martinez, congratulations on another successful mission," Admiral Westbrook began. "Master Chief Walsh's after-action report describes your tactical assessment as instrumental to the operation's success, but that's not why we're speaking today." The Admiral activated a presentation that displayed recruitment statistics, training graduation rates, and demographic analyses that Rebecca didn't immediately understand. Since your graduation from BUDS 2 years ago, applications from female candidates have increased by 400%. More significantly, the quality of those applicants has exceeded our most optimistic projections. We now have female candidates entering the program with qualifications that rival the top male applicants in our history. Rebecca began to understand where the conversation was heading. Her success hadn't just broken a personal barrier, it had inspired a generation of women to pursue careers they had never before considered possible. "We're creating a new position within Naval Special Warfare Command," Admiral Westbrook continued, "Special Advisor for Candidate Development and Integration. The role would involve overseeing training protocols, mentoring promising candidates, and ensuring that the reforms implemented after the Thompson investigation continue to evolve and improve." The offer was extraordinary, a chance to shape the future of SEAL training and ensure that no candidate would ever again face the kind of systematic abuse she had endured. But it would also mean leaving combat operations just as her career was reaching its peak. Admiral, I'm honored by the offer, but I need to ask, would this position be created specifically because I'm a woman? Because if so, I'm not interested in being anyone's token. Admiral Westbrook smiled. Martinez, this position is being created because you've demonstrated exceptional leadership, tactical thinking, and the kind of institutional knowledge that comes from experiencing our training system from a unique perspective. Your gender is relevant only because it gives you insights that no male operator could provide. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering the scope of responsibilities, the impact the role could have on future training, and the precedent it would set for other women entering special operations. By the end, Rebecca understood that this wasn't just a career opportunity. It was a chance to complete the transformation she had begun by graduating from BUDS. She accepted the position. 6 months later, Rebecca found herself standing in the same BUDS classroom where Thompson had once tried to psychologically break her. But now she was the instructor, addressing a class of candidates that included 4 women among the 32 trainees. The sight would have been unimaginable just 3 years earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rebecca began, her voice carrying the authority that came from proven combat experience, "welcome to the most challenging training program in the United States military. Over the next 6 months, you'll be tested in ways that will reveal who you really are when everything else is stripped away." She paused, making eye contact with each candidate, remembering her own first day and the fear and determination she'd felt. "Some of you will fail this program. That's inevitable and necessary. Not everyone has what it takes to be a SEAL operator. But I promise you this. Every one of you will be evaluated based solely on your performance, your character, and your potential to serve effectively in combat. The games, the politics, the personal vendettas that once poisoned this institution, they're over." Among the candidates listening to her briefing was Sarah Chen, Marcus's younger sister, who had followed her brother's path into military service. Sitting beside her was Maria Rodriguez, a former Marine whose brother Carlos was now serving with Rebecca's old team in Afghanistan. The ripple effects of Rebecca's breakthrough were becoming visible in the new generation of warriors entering the program. After the briefing, Rebecca walked the same beach where she had endured countless hours of punishment under Thompson's regime. The physical landmarks were unchanged, the same sand, the same waves, the same unforgiving Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Commander Torres, who had replaced Thompson as the lead instructor for advanced training phases, joined her on the beach. "How does it feel to be back?" he asked. Rebecca considered the question carefully. "Like coming home to a place that tried to kill you but made you stronger instead." "Any regrets about leaving combat operations?" "No," Rebecca replied without hesitation. "What we're doing here is combat operations. We're fighting for the soul of this institution, making sure it lives up to its potential rather than being held back by the prejudices and limitations of people like Thompson." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Hayes, who had requested a meeting to discuss the psychological support protocols being implemented for candidates facing exceptional challenges. "Rebecca, I wanted to update you on the changes we've made to mental health monitoring," Dr. Hayes said as they walked toward the medical facility. "We now have mandatory counseling sessions for any candidate showing signs of excessive stress, and instructors are required to report unusual injury patterns or behavioral changes." The reforms extended far beyond policy changes. The entire culture of BUDS training was evolving, maintaining the rigorous standards that produced elite operators while eliminating the toxic elements that had allowed predators like Thompson to flourish. 6 months into her new role, Rebecca received a letter that would prove to be one of the most significant moments of her career. It came from a young woman named Jennifer, Master Chief Walsh's daughter, who was preparing to apply for BUDS training after graduating from the Naval Academy. "Dear Petty Officer Martinez," the letter began, "I wanted to thank you for showing me that dreams I never thought possible could become reality. When I was growing up, my father would tell me stories about SEAL operations, and I would imagine what it would be like to serve alongside him. But I knew it was just a fantasy because women weren't allowed in special operations. Your graduation changed that. Because of what you accomplished, I get to chase a dream that an entire generation of women before me never had the chance to pursue. The letter continued. I know the path ahead won't be easy. People will question whether I belong, whether I can meet the standards, whether having women in SEAL teams makes everyone less safe. But I also know that you faced all of those questions and more, and you proved them wrong through your actions rather than your words. That's the example I plan to follow. That evening, Rebecca called her father in Phoenix to share Jennifer's letter. He listened quietly as she read it aloud, and when she finished, there was a long silence on the phone. "Mija," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion, "do you remember what I told you about the hardest battles being against people who are supposed to be on your side?" "I remember. I was wrong about something. I told you those were the hardest battles, but I didn't tell you they were also the most important ones. The easy fights don't change anything. It's the battles that seem impossible, the ones where you're fighting against the entire system, that create real change." Rebecca understood what he meant. Thompson's campaign against her hadn't just been personal cruelty. It had been the embodiment of an entire institutional culture that saw women as inherently unfit for elite military service. By surviving and ultimately thriving despite that opposition, she had proven that the culture itself was wrong. A year later, Jennifer Walsh became the second woman to graduate from Buds, finishing third in her class. She was followed by Maria Rodriguez, then Sarah Chen, then a steady stream of women who proved that Rebecca's success hadn't been a fluke or an exception. Thompson, meanwhile, had been released from military prison and was working as a security guard at a shopping mall in Oklahoma, his military credentials permanently stripped away. Occasionally, local reporters would track him down for interviews about the Martinez case, but he always declined to comment. The man who had once held the power to make or break SEAL careers had become a footnote in the history he had tried to prevent. 10 years after her graduation, now Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Martinez stood before a joint session of Congress, testifying about the integration of women into special operations forces. The hearing room was packed with military leaders, politicians, and journalists, all listening as she described the transformation of America's most elite military units. "Honorable members of Congress," she concluded her testimony, "the question isn't whether women can meet the standards required for special operations. We've proven that definitively. The question is whether we as a nation are committed to fielding the most capable military force possible, regardless of the gender of the warriors who comprise it." The standing ovation that followed seemed to last forever, but Rebecca barely heard it. She was thinking about the young women sitting in high school classrooms across America, watching her testimony on television and beginning to imagine possibilities they had never before considered. She was thinking about Thompson and how his attempts to destroy her had instead created a legacy that would outlast them both. Most of all, she was thinking about her father, who had died peacefully in his sleep 6 months earlier, but not before seeing his daughter transform from a determined young woman into a force that had changed military history forever. The girl from Phoenix had become exactly what she had always dreamed of being, not just a SEAL, but a leader who had opened doors that could never be closed again. And in doing so, she had proven that the strongest steel was forged in the hottest fire, tempered by adversity, into something unbreakable. Thompson had tried to break her and failed. Instead, he had created a legend that would inspire generations of warriors to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.